Welcome to the Plagues Project.
10 Plagues, Many Angles.
Now more than ever.
Come learn with us.
The question I want to ask is there any historical extra-biblical evidence which we have that can help us understand the story of the 10 plagues as it's preserved in the Torah? Now, we know that by 1900 BCE, this painting was created that in a tomb of a local governor named Khnumhotep II, who lived in the central part of Egypt. And in his tomb, he recorded the visit of a group of people he called the A'amu, people who are presented in the traditional way in which Egyptians present Semites. This is about the first of these representations in Egypt, but later there will be many more after 1900. Now, A'amu is a place that is, and these are the people of A'amu. A'amu was somewhere between Syria, modern-day Syria, and modern-day Israel. The second group of people who with a Semitic background, whom the Egyptians mention, is a group that the Egyptians called the Heka Hasut, rulers from foreign countries, who, according to the Egyptians, lived in, both from archaeological sources and from literary sources, lived in the Eastern Delta with a capital city at the town of Avaris, which you can see here on the map. And on your right, the archaeological site with the modern village where Avaris is now represented. These Heka Hasut, later known in Greek as the Hyksos, come to this area by about the 18th century BCE, or what the Egyptologists would call the late 12th dynasty. And they are here for nearly 600 years, to the period which an Egyptologist would call Dynasty 20, that is the mid-12th century BCE. The archaeological excavations conducted by Manfred Bietak at the site of Avaris, the modern name is Tel Adaba, demonstrated that there was a large group of people living in this town whose material culture was very similar, almost identical, to the Semites of the Canaanite area. They lived in the East Delta, as I said, for about 600 years. And if you look at things like their temple architecture, their house architecture, their burial customs, and the pottery that they used every day, that these features are very, very similar to Canaanite temple architecture, Canaanite house architecture, Canaanite burial customs, and also the daily use pottery of the Canaanites. And this site is occupied from the end of the 12th dynasty to the middle of the 20th dynasty. We also have textual information which refers to a Northwest Semitic-speaking group of people living here in the interior of Egypt. This text, known as Papyrus Brooklyn 35 1446 A to E, preserved at the Brooklyn Museum, is a list. It's actually a payroll for a textile producing facility, and there are 95 employees. 45 of the employees have Northwest Semitic names. So we have really strong textual evidence of Semites in Egypt in this time period, as well as very strong archaeological evidence. Now, What about the plagues themselves? The 10 plagues, as I'm sure you know, record a series of increasingly serious ecological disasters which befell the Egyptians because they would not allow the children of Israel to leave Egypt, starting with the Nile River turning to blood and ending with the death of the firstborn of the Egyptians. Now, there really is no ancient Egyptian literary evidence of any of these plagues, and there is really no ancient Egyptian. These kinds of plagues really don't fall into the kinds of natural disasters or supernatural disasters that the Egyptians ever talk about. There is some minor evidence of of Hebrew literary borrowing from the Egyptians in the time of King Akhenaten in the 14th century BCE. The hymn which this king wrote to his god, the Aten, has many overlaps with Psalm 104. There are also texts, a text called The Wisdom of Amenemope, which seems to have been known to the writer of the Wisdom of Solomon, Qoheleth. But otherwise, the text of the Hebrew Bible is pretty unaware of ancient Egyptian literary constructions. What the one plague which is mentioned in an Egyptian text is the river turning to blood, which is known from a text called the Ipuwer papyrus by an unknown author, although it's attributed to a man named Ipuwer, who seems to have lived sometime from the beginning of the 20th century BCE to the end of the 19th century BCE, or Dynasty 12 for an Egyptologist. But the text is only preserved in a Dynasty 19 papyrus, as you see here, so the 13th century BCE. It does mention a river of blood and servants running away, but none of this can be logically associated with the Exodus or with the stories of the plagues. Now, the rest of the disasters, which are mentioned in the plagues, show a definite knowledge of the ecology of Egypt and what could go wrong there. But this list does not show any influence from Egyptian literary creations that are currently known to us. For the Egyptians, the most common ecological disaster that they discuss is famine. Just once, the mention of a mysterious illness that was brought to Egypt by the Hyksos, this group of Northwest Semitic speaking Semites. Famine is commonly mentioned in several periods of ancient Egyptian history, but the context is always one where a wise and generous ruler relieved famine for the people. This is actually the antithesis of the way the Pharaoh is described in the biblical narrative. Now, the text which mentions the mysterious disease brought to Egypt by the Hyksos is first recorded at this temple, which was built by Hatshepsut in the 15th century BCE. The text itself was taken over by King Seti I of the 19th dynasty in approximately the 13th century BCE. But then the text, the knowledge of this plague brought by the Hyksos seems to have been incorporated into a much later text, almost 1,000 years later, a history of Egypt written by Manetho, a Greek speaking Egyptian who wrote a history of Egypt for his Ptolemaic, or that is Greek speaking masters at the end of ancient Egyptian history. And then this text of Manetho, written about the 3rd century BCE, is quoted by the Jewish historian Josephus in order to refute it. Josephus wrote in the 1st century of the Common Era, also in Greek, so he would have been able to have easy access to what Manetho had to say. And it is Josephus who is the first historian to associate the Hyksos with the Bnei Yisrael, with the children of Israel. The illness is not at all a source for the 10 plagues, though some scholars have claimed it is the beginning of the anti-Semitic trope that the Jews bring disease. Here is a kind of romanticized woodcut of Flavius Josephus, the Jewish historian. This is from a 17th century edition of Josephus's work. So there is some evidence that the Hebrew writer of the Bible is drawing on some very old traditions about Semites in Egypt when he tells the story of Joseph and also the story of the Exodus. But the story of the 10 plagues specifically only draws on a knowledge of the ecology of Egypt, not on any Egyptian literary tradition. The story of the 10 plagues is most likely an independent literary construction based on common knowledge of Egypt in the home of the writer.